Reborn, my Duke Fiancé announced our betrothal was a mistake. I signed the annulment before he finished the sentence. Frostbite had taken my fingers before the fever took the rest of me. Alone in a gatehouse tower nobody thought to check for 11 days. That was how my first life ended, forgotten, not murdered, which somehow felt worse. When I opened my eyes again, there was no frost. There was candlelight, silk gloves on my hands, and the low murmur of 100 nobles filling the Wintermere ballroom on the night of my formal betrothal announcement to Duke Cassian Vane. I knew this exact night. I had lived it once already, 4 years before the tower, before the slow unraveling that ended with everyone conveniently forgetting where they'd locked their inconvenient duchess. "I've given this a great deal of thought," Cassian said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear, his voice carrying the practiced weight of a man performing regret rather than feeling it. "I believe this betrothal was arranged in haste. I don't think Lady Aloan and I suit one another. In my first life, I had begged him, right there on the dance floor, in front of everyone whose opinion I'd been raised to care about. I had asked what I'd done wrong. He never answered because there was no answer, only a slow campaign afterward to make my confusion look like instability, my loyalty look like desperation, until difficult Lady Aloan became easy to lock away and easier still to forget. This time, I reached into the small velvet pouch on my wrist, withdrew the folded annulment petition my own solicitor had drafted a week earlier, because I'd remembered, this time, to prepare for exactly this moment, and held it out to him with a steady hand. "I agree completely, Your Grace," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the murmuring crowd. "I've taken the liberty of drafting the paperwork myself. All that's missing is your signature." The ballroom went utterly silent. Cassian stared at the folded parchment like it might bite him. "You already drafted this? I find it saves everyone a great deal of unnecessary heartbreak," I said pleasantly, "when both parties are honest at the same time." A ripple of astonished laughter moved through the crowd, not mockery of me, this time, but of him, standing there holding an annulment he hadn't expected to actually receive. In my first life, this moment had been his triumph. I had just quietly stolen it. Lord Wintermere, my host and Cassian's own uncle, stepped forward from the dais, silver brows raised high. "Lady Aloan, are you certain? An annulment before the marriage even occurs is unusual. It will raise questions about the Ashcombe family's standing." "With respect, my lord," I said, curtsying with perfect composure, "I'd rather raise questions about my judgment than spend a lifetime married to a man who requires a ballroom full of witnesses to admit he's changed his mind." The old lord's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Cassian's jaw tightened. He'd wanted me humiliated, weeping, easy to paint as the unstable one. Instead I'd made him look like a boy who'd brought fireworks to his own funeral and forgotten to light them. My mother did not speak to me on the ride home. In my first life, she'd wept and pleaded with Cassian's family for a reconciliation, spending what little leverage the Ashcombe name still held. That single act of desperation had been the first crack the Vane family used to slowly isolate me, first from court, then from my own household, until the isolation became a tower nobody thought to unlock. This time, I intended to make sure there was no leverage left for anyone to spend. "You planned this," my mother finally said, staring out at the passing gaslit streets. "You had that paperwork ready before he even opened his mouth." "I did." "How could you possibly have known?" I chose my next words carefully. The truth was not one she could carry, and I had learned, somewhere in 11 days of frozen silence, that not every truth needed an audience. "I've watched him for months, Mother," I said instead. "A man who avoids his own betrothed at every private gathering doesn't need a psychic to predict what he's building toward." I simply decided to stop being surprised by things I could see coming. She studied me a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes. You've changed. I've stopped performing patience for people who mistake it for permission, I said. That's all. The annulment cleared quietly within the month, quiet, because I made certain of it. I requested no public statement, filed no grievance, gave the gossip columns nothing dramatic to chew on. A woman who refuses to perform heartbreak is remarkably hard to turn into a villain. Cassian, however, gave them plenty. Freed of an engagement he'd apparently wanted gone for other reasons, he wasted no time publicly courting Lady Rosalind Faircastle, daughter of a minor baron whose family, I discovered from my own household ledgers within weeks, had been quietly loaning Cassian considerable sums against the assumption that the Vane-Ashcombe marriage would eventually merge both estates' debts into one manageable fortune. An assumption that had just evaporated along with the engagement. I learned this not through spies or scandal, but through the single most useful skill my first life had never taught me, reading contracts before signing them, and reading them again after I hadn't. The Faircastle loans were secured against Vaneland. My family's solicitor, a meticulous woman named Agatha Ponn, told me over tea 3 weeks later, using projected income from an estate merger that no longer exists. Without that merger, Duke Vane owes Baron Faircastle considerably more than his current holdings can cover. How considerably? She slid a single sheet across the table. I didn't gasp. I'd learned, this time, that gasping was a currency I no longer needed to spend. Do nothing, I told her. Simply make sure our family's own creditors know we bear no obligation toward covering any portion of the Vane estate's debts, now or ever. In writing. Publicly filed. Agatha's mouth curved, slow and approving. You're protecting the Ashcombe name. I'm removing us from a fire I have no intention of being blamed for lighting, I said. By early spring, the fire lit itself without my help. Baron Faircastle, discovering the merger he'd banked on no longer existed, called in his loans in full. Cassian, unable to pay, was forced to sell 2 of his 3 country estates within a single humiliating season, the same estates he'd once described to me, in an early, less guarded conversation, as the only things my family has that actually matter. I attended the season's opening gala in deep amethyst silk that spring, composed and radiant, while whispers followed Cassian's diminished fortune around the ballroom like a shadow he couldn't outrun. You look remarkably unbothered, said a low voice beside me, for a woman whose ex-fiancé is currently the talk of every drawing room in the capital. I turned. Lord Bennet Aldrich, quiet, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who'd spent years being underestimated for staying silent in rooms full of louder men, offered me a glass of wine with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be. His fortune isn't my concern, Lord Aldrich, I said, accepting the glass. I simply declined an invitation to share in its ruin. That's a rather clever way of describing walking away at exactly the right moment. People assume walking away requires anger, I said. Sometimes it only requires paying attention. Bennet studied me for a long moment, something genuinely curious behind his usual careful reserve. You are not at all the woman the rumour mill described you as, Lady Aloan. The rumour mill, I said, has never once been in the room when anything actually happened. He laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the first I'd heard all evening. I believe, Lady Ashcombe, you and I are going to get along extremely well. Cassian came to my family's townhouse uninvited on a wet evening in late spring, his once immaculate coat visibly worn at the cuffs, his composure entirely gone. Aloan, he said, water dripping from his hair onto our entryway floor, I need you to speak to your solicitor. There are rumors that the Ashcombe family influenced Faircastle's decision to call in my loans. I influenced nothing, Your Grace, I said calmly, not rising from my seat by the fire. I simply made certain no one mistook my family for a source of continued credit. What Baron Faircastle chose to do with that information was entirely his own decision. You knew this would happen. I knew a great many things, I said. That's rather the point of paying attention. His hands curled into fists at his sides, desperation cracking through what remained of his pride. I made a mistake, breaking things off the way I did. Publicly. It was cruel. I see that now. If we reconciled, if the engagement were reinstated. No, I said, before he'd even finished. You haven't even considered. I don't need to consider it, I said, standing to meet his gaze, unhurried and entirely calm. You didn't want a wife, Cassian. You wanted an audience for your own liberation, and a bank you assumed would keep funding you regardless of how you treated the woman attached to it. I'm neither of those things anymore. I'm not certain I ever should have been. He left without another word, his footsteps echoing hollow down our front steps, into the rain. A year after that ballroom announcement, I stood on the terrace of my own townhouse, purchased outright, in my name alone, with funds I'd quietly and carefully managed since the night I refused to let anyone else's mistakes become my inheritance. Bennett joined me there most evenings now, not out of obligation, but because he'd chosen to, again and again, in a way no one in my first life ever had. A toast, he said, handing me a glass, to the woman who signed her own freedom before anyone else could take credit for it. I looked out over the city lights, warm and unbothered by memories of frost that no longer had any power over me. To paying attention, I said, before it's too late to matter. We drank. Somewhere across the city, I imagined, Cassian was still trying to explain to someone why the woman he'd humiliated in front of 300 witnesses had somehow ended up the only person in the room who walked away richer, freer, and entirely unbroken. I found, for the first time in either of my lives, that I didn't need to imagine his regret to feel complete. My own peace, finally, was enough. If you loved watching Aloan turn a public humiliation into quiet, total independence, hit that like button and subscribe for more Reborn revenge stories every week. Let us know in the comments, should she have taken Bennett's toast a step further, or is a quiet, unattached freedom the real victory here?